Joe Rogan and Duncan Trussell wondering if we're living through the end times. Spoiler alert, we are.
This is where being raised an Episcopalian, in the book of Revelation, as a Christian, you're going to read it. This is where I get scared because it's too similar to the mark of the beast. It's too similar to exactly what it says. You won't be able to trade. You won't be able to do anything unless you have the mark, unless you bear the mark. So
what is that in that term? How is that described? How is the mark of the beast described in the Bible? We should read it because I think you're onto something.
We're now officially podcasting. This is fucking it. We're opening up the book of Revelations.
Yeah.
We're in now.
When it comes to like the end times and whether we're living in the end times, I mean, that conversation can get a little bit annoying. I try to take a more sober approach. We're going to look at something from Irenaeus, early Christian, and we're going to look at something from Michael Heiser, a more modern Christian. Both have very sober takes on what is 666, what is the mark of the beast, how do we currently understand what John might be revealing in this chapter of Revelation that they're about to read.
Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from the heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain.
Fuck.
It also causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666.
Yeah, so there's another thing here with the idea of Antichrist as well. And oftentimes we're trying to like point to like one Antichrist, whereas Scripture actually tells us that there are many Antichrists. And when you read that passage, what you're seeing is that the beasts behave like a type of Christ. And that will tie into how we interpret 666. Because again, we're looking for something that makes sense out of the whole Bible picture, the whole sort of cosmic battle that the Bible portrays. And when you read Revelation, and Heiser does a really good job of this, you have to look at how John uses the Old Testament throughout the book of Revelation. And so tying our interpretation into the Old Testament is going to be key to really understanding this passage.
It gets weirder when you get to the original. Like when you get to the original, because like, you know, one of the reasons that seems weird is because that's a code that like, it's not like it's encoded. Like there's some kind of like other thing in there.
Jimmy just pulled this up. The classical Greek word charagma, translated as mark of the beast in Revelation 13:16, can also mean any mark engraved, imprinted, or branded, stamped money, document, or coin. The mark of the beast is interpreted differently across the four main views of Christian eschatology.
Dude. Yeah, and is it a code? Now, I struggle with this because I believe that the Bible does speak plainly about things. So I don't, and I think this is where people can get weird. They're looking for all the codes, and they're looking for all the, like, connections, and you're connecting the dots. You're doing a bunch of gymnastics to try to explain what you might believe about this passage. And I think the explanation is actually a little bit more plain, a little bit more straightforward. And if you have read the Old Testament, I think you're gonna see that it really does kind of fit together. So at this point, I want to actually share something from Irenaeus, and I'm a fan of classical studies. So for me, it's like the older things are usually the more reliable things. That's kind of a rule I try to follow. This is from about 180 AD, his work against heresies. I will leave the link to this, but we just want to point out a few things. The first thing is, it is therefore more certain and less hazardous to await the fulfillment of the prophecy. So if it hasn't been revealed yet, maybe it's not necessary yet, that it was put there for the church living at a certain time in a certain place. And when we need it, it will become more clear. When we need to understand this passage better, it'll become more clear. So pump the brakes. We don't need to be getting weird and theorizing here. We just need to kind of let God's word do its work. So await the fulfillment of the prophecy, then making any surmise or casting about any names that may present themselves, inasmuch as many names can be found possessing the number mentioned. And so what they would do is they would take the numerical value of a certain letter, they would add those up. And what Irenaeus is saying is you can make a lot of things fit 666. You can make a lot of names fit into this number 666. So again, kind of pump the brakes a little bit. He throws out some suggestions, but then he writes this, which I think is really interesting. He looks at the word Teitan, and particularly this alternate spelling of it, and he throws this out as a suggestion. And again, this to me is really interesting when you start to think of Genesis chapter 6. Okay, among all the names which are found among us, it is rather worthy of credit, for it has in itself the predicted number, 666. I have it down here. So if you look at the numerical value of this, it would be 305, 10, 301, 50, and that adds up to 666. So he's saying this could be one worthy of note. And besides this, it's an ancient name, one worthy of credit, of royal dignity, and still further, the name belongs to a tyrant. Inasmuch then as the name Teitan has so much to recommend it, there's a strong degree of probability that from among the many names suggested, we infer that perchance he who is to come shall be called Teitan. That's Irenaeus. I think that that's really helpful. It gives us, like, again, a pretty sober take on this. I really do like that we're not trying to find one particular person in history, but more like a category of this Titan or tyrannical Titan-like figure. Now, how does this connect to Genesis 6? How does this help us form a full biblical kind of cosmology? How does it tie into kind of the cosmic battle that we know is going on? Michael Heiser is going to help us with that. And I'll leave these verses and stuff in the show notes for you. Now, why should we care? Again, I discussed this a bit. He wrote a book, Revising Herman, with 666 and Teitan, or this alternate spelling. There's no direct Old Testament reference here, so it's an analogical argument. Basically, it goes like this. 666 points to a Titan. The Titans were giants in the Greco-Roman retelling of Genesis 6. One of those was Nimrod in Jewish tradition. Again, not in the Bible, but Jewish tradition. Nimrod is called a Gabor, which could be used for giant. It doesn't have to be because David and God are both called Gabor. Okay, so Nimrod's there, but you go from 666 to Titan to giants to Nimrod, and Nimrod, of course, is associated with Babel. Again, there's no biblical text that makes those connections, but they are interesting, worthy of note, basically. So I wrote this in Revising Herman. The point being made here is not that the Antichrist will be a giant. No biblical or enotic text draws such a conclusion. Rather, the material indicates that Second Temple Jewish readers of Revelation may have parsed the Antichrist as having a direct association with fallen watchers, the classical titans and giants. So they would have made that association to Genesis 6. We kind of have forgotten that. So that's possible. The Nimrod trajectory establishes that possibility, so I kind of like that. This is, again, Heiser, because I think that the number has something to do with Babel. Why does he think that? Because it comes up at the end of Revelation. You get to the Babylon, the great whore. Okay, so again, it just ties enough together for me. I think it's really helpful. Again, we're not looking for a particular person, but a kind of person who is connected to this Titan-like being, this Titan that we get from Genesis chapter 6. There's this divine council. Those who were in rebellion went down and had children with human women. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. They took wives for themselves, forever who they chose. They bore children to them. Verse 4, this is Genesis 6, verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, they were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So you tie the whole thing together. I'm going to do one step further and actually go back to Genesis chapter 3 and point something out really quick. The plan of God, after Adam and Eve fall, God says this to the serpent, to the one who was in rebellion. He says this. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And he shall bruise you on the heel, and you shall bruise him on the head. And he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So in the act of crushing the serpent in the head, this he of Genesis 3:15 will himself take a wound. Okay, again, tying back to Revelation 13, this beast who comes and has this wound. Okay, but that's an Antichrist sort of manifestation of this actual, who Christ actually is. So what does the serpent do with this information in Genesis 3:15? He goes, well, my seed and her seed, the seed of the woman. I mean, that takes you right back to Genesis 6. They took daughters of men who were beautiful. They took wives. So they took women, and what did they do? They tried to have little manifestations of themselves. They had tried to incarnate themselves, not allowing God to just work out his plan. They're doing this in rebellion to God's plan. They look at God's plan and they go, well, if God is going to do this, we're going to do it too. And so again, this idea of Teitan, this half divine being, half human, that to me has way more to lend to it. We get a full picture of the cosmic battle that's been going on from Genesis to Revelation. It's not one strange verse taken out of context and then fixated on. It is a whole story arc that we're looking at. That to me is why I lean towards this Irenaeus and Michael Heiser kind of interpretation of 666. For me, I go back to Ephesians 6 and passages like this. I mean, finally be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might, put on the full armor of God, so you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, it's against the rulers and powers, against the world forces in this darkness, against the spiritual forces and wickedness in heavenly places. I've talked about this verse over and over again on this podcast, so you guys are probably sick of hearing me quote it, but I just keep coming back to this. I don't need to fixate on the codes and the names and how it all works together. I don't need to fixate on the Antichrist. I need to fix my eyes on Christ so that when the day comes, we will not be deceived. And that means that we won't be led into fear. That, I think, is the big risk here, is that people will come and begin to try to cause everyone to become afraid, and by doing that, be able to manipulate people. But if my eyes are fixated on Jesus, I have nothing to fear. So with that, I'll catch you in the next one.